Well, it seems that the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump is not yet quite finished carrying out its entire economic war against China. Senior U.S. officials have begun exploring proposals for punishing and demanding financial compensation from China for its handling of the coronavirus, according to four senior administration officials with knowledge of this internal planning. Senior officials across multiple government agencies are expecting to meet on Thursday to begin mapping out a strategy for retaliatory measures against China for the COVID 19 outbreak. Now, these, I guess you could call them whistleblowers, in private, Trump aides have discussed stripping China of its sovereign immunity. Now, this is significant because it's very much related to the legal status of foreign governments as it relates to domestic law. They're aiming to enable the victims of the U.S. to be able to sue the Chinese government for damages. Now, obviously, legal experts have all weighed into this, and they say that an attempt to limit China's sovereign immunity would be extremely difficult to do and would more than likely require congressional legislation in order to do so. Although I feel that at this time, given the nature of the relationship between China and the United States, that might not be too difficult to actually obtain. Now, some administration officials have also discussed the United States cancel part of its debt to China, which would be very significant and harmful to the Chinese economy, just simply abolishing certain obligations to the country. Asked about this on Thursday, Trump said, "You start playing those games, and that's tough." He said that canceling interest payments to China could undermine the sanctity of the dollar. But he added that there will be other ways to levy extreme penalties on China, such as raising $1 trillion by imposing tariffs on Chinese imports. That's a very dangerous game to play because one of the reasons why U.S. Treasury bonds have value is the faith and trust in the U.S. government that they will pay those Treasury bonds. Now, if you start an incident where you're not paying them, that makes the U.S. Treasury bonds become sketchy. And now people are going to wonder whether or not they have the real value if the U.S. can just suddenly decide not to pay their obligations because they're throwing a temper tantrum over China and trying to undermine a competing global power. So they would harm their own interests by doing so, but there would be a huge benefit in not having to give X amount of money to China as they are contractually obligated to do. So you see how a little bit complicated this situation is. Now, on Thursday, Gang Shuang, a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, did speak to reporters. The U.S. should know that their economy is the virus, not China. They should focus on containment at home and international cooperation, instead of smearing China and shifting the blame onto China. As for punishment or accountability, as I have repeatedly stated, such rhetoric has no legal basis, and there's no international precedent. At this time, undermining others' efforts will end up undermining oneself. Now, obviously, if the United States was to do this, simply just cancel part of its debt to China, China would have to retaliate because of the economic damage that they would suffer as a result. Keep in mind that China buys U.S. treasuries to keep its value at a certain place so that China can sell goods more cheaply to the United States. That's part of the trade relationship that they've had for more than a decade. And then this would be deliberately sabotaging that. How much damage it would do would remain to be seen. Largely a question of what China would do to retaliate, considering that they are the two largest trading partners in the world. Now think about this. If you do this kind of damage to China, they're going to retaliate. Think about the fact that most of the U.S. PPE, personal protective equipment, comes from Chinese manufacturers. China could turn around tomorrow and just completely cut it off. And then the United States would be in a very serious situation. especially for the people who are still denying that this is an emergency situation. They'd probably be happy about that. So think about this. This is one of those things that can expand into a larger issue. You start provoking essentially another trade war with China, they're going to retaliate. And this is something that would turn into essentially could turn into essentially a full-blown Cold War. Is that really what the world needs right now? When it's trying ever? Does it ever need that? Does it really need it now that we're trying to deal with a global outbreak of a very contagious virus? No, obviously this is not. This whole focus and attention on attacking China has been to cover up the incompetence of the U.S. government in dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. They had more than enough heads up. Other countries had enough heads up. But the U.S. chose not to take direct action right away because they didn't want to harm the economy. Taking these measures will harm the economy. So they put it off as long as they could. They ended up making the situation worse than it could have been. It could have been a lot better. And so now that they've suffered the damage for that, rather than admit they were wrong in the policy or the lack of policies that they chose, they're now going to try to shift that blame onto China and blame them for everything the U.S. has failed with. Now, keep in mind, this is also about attacking what China is doing globally right now. China is giving out all these masks, donating tons of personal protective equipment, etc., to countries that need them. This is raising the profile of China around the world, making it much more positive. And you have the U.S. pirating from other people, sanctioning countries, preventing them from getting the necessary medical equipment. And you can kind of figure out pretty quickly here who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. The U.S. is looking worse and China's looking better. So this also is a propaganda operation against China to undermine the goodwill that it is building across the globe. And it also has the effect of rallying the American people around the common enemy that is China, and using that to build solidarity between the people and the U.S. government. This has a tendency to detract from much of the culpability that the U.S. government has for its lack of dealing with this situation. So you see, it's very, very smart. You get to attack China, which is a rival global power. You get to undermine their efforts to raise their own image across the world. And you get to essentially tramp down criticism at home by building solidarity with the people that you victimize by pointing to an external enemy. And I think that this is not a new thing in history. I think this has repeated itself many times. So you can see this is kind of like a threefold effect that this policy has. And from the perspective of the U.S. empire, it's a pretty damn good policy. And it's going to forward U.S. imperial interests very well. It's a very smart move to make. A horribly evil move to make, but a good one from their perspective, nonetheless. So it's important to keep this in mind. It is important to remind the people in America that China is not their enemy. China did not do this to you. This naturally happens every 100 years or so. Your anger should be placed at your own government for putting the profits of the ruling elite over your lives. That's what people should be angry about. You should be demanding action from your own government to solve the situation rather than try to attack somebody else for their own incompetence. And that is the message that people should receive. And I think it's an important one. And I think that one that a good majority of my audience also shares.
Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.